Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V. Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is a brief session regarding the role of the war in the Middle East and its impact on the upcoming election uh, that is on Tuesday, November 5th, in just a week. Historically, as people know, foreign policy has not played a catalytic role in determining election outcomes in the United States. There have been exceptions in the 20th century, and we will very briefly look at those. Before going on to that, I would like to point out that the United States unique system of the Electoral College actually determining the outcome of the race is also an important factor, considering that the winner needs 270 electoral votes out of a total of 538. That is indicative of the reality that the United States is not what the ancient Athenians who invented democracy called direct or radical democracy, that is, individual qualified voters directly representing themselves, nor is it a popular democracy. This system, in fact, the Electoral College system, is in fact a system that is a leftover from the time that the United States was founded to prevent a lopsided result during the founding of the country. There were concerns about the southern slave states having more of an influence. However, the Electoral College, there is almost universal agreement on the part of the critics, is an elitist system, unrepresentative, obviously, of the will of the voter, because you can have a situation, and there have been such situations, where the popular vote is one way, but the candidate who winds up in the White House is that individual who has not captured the majority popular vote. Having said that, let me point out that the Western media, from the New York Times to the Guardian in the UK, have been running articles coming up to the election, that somehow there are in fact differences between the the mainstream Democratic candidate, obviously Vice President Kamala Harris, and the former President of the United States representing the Republican Party, Donald Trump, a well-known um, uh, individual and well known for his foreign policy. The question is whether there has been any, not just now, but since 1947, since President Truman, who was the first, obviously, um, sitting president when Israel was founded in 1948, whether there has been any difference in the position of the United States toward Israel, and whether, in fact, the Israeli war, apart first of all, the apartheid Zionist state conditions that are imposed historically have been imposed on the Palestinians, and whether any of its wars, whether in Lebanon, from 78 in the 1980s, whether the Six Days War in 1967, the Yom Kippur War in 1973, whether the current genocide in Gaza, whether any of these have made any difference. Well, the argument is today on the part of some that there may be a difference, especially since Israel decided to expand this genocide war from Gaza to Lebanon and onto Syria, hitting Syria hard, by the way. That's one of the things that has not been, that has not made much of a headline news in the West, but also obviously the ultimate target, hitting Iran. And the question, and this is in the last few weeks running up to the election, and the question is, will any of this make any difference for the voters in the United States on Tuesday, November 5? Let me point out, by the way, that um, the United States, again, I emphasize historically, has reliably decided elections, that is, the people who do vote, decided elections on the economy. According to public opinion polls in 2024, this election is no different. The economy, which of course is intertwined with inflationary pressures owing in large measure to, to two very expensive uh, proxy wars, because that's what they are, by the way. One is in Ukraine, behind which is the United States and its junior partners, NATO, and that is lingering on. It's a war of attrition, it seems so far. And the other is Israel, which on the surface, there is all this talk about the US wanting ceasefire, not approving of Israel expanding the war, not approving of Israel wanting an all out confrontation with Iran. But in fact, in point of fact, the US has the US has military personnel, intelligence personnel on the ground in Israel. It is right there side by side with the IDF. The US is providing the bombs that are responsible, have been responsible for the campaigns that Israel has conducted from Gaza to Lebanon to Syria and Iran and Yemen. So this is not a secret, but rather a matter of record. Okay. So the rhetoric is ceasefire, peace, and it is related to election politics, presidential election politics. And and the question for in voters' mind is the degree to which this is in the national interest of the United States, not national interest as defined by Wall Street and the military industrial complex, but national interest as defined in terms of what is best for the American people. And I don't mean the 1%, the richest 1% that owns more wealth than the bottom 90% of the population in a country with almost 12% poverty rate, while China has eliminated extreme poverty, by the way. This is very serious considering all of this, and I underscore this point because these two wars are taking place against the background of a declining economic America, an America that's declining, whose role in the world economy, as measured by the IMF and the World Bank in terms of its share of GDP, is declining in terms of share of manufacturing, trade, in every respect. The US economy is in retreat. This is also in terms of technology, considering that China is way ahead, not just of the US, but the entire world, in quantum computers, as they have announced recently. And just this morning, there was the announcement of a supersonic, not supersonic plane that will make it from Beijing to New York City in 2 hours. It's in the design phase right now, and by 2027, it's just a couple of years, it will be operational, assuming all goes well. The area of semiconductors is another one, and artificial intelligence, that the United States has tried to prevent China from moving ahead, but it has. So the election is taking place against such a background, and the war in the Middle East, as well as the one in Ukraine, these twin wars, behind which is the United States, because without the United States, neither of those would be at this level. They could have taken place, but not to this degree. This is universally recognized by the international community, including the United Nations, by the way. So this is the reality. Now, the question of whether these two particular candidates are going to make any difference in terms of future policy toward Israel. And how will that be best for the American people? Because this is an election to determine the future of the American people. This is not an election to cater to any foreign country. This is to determine the fate of the American people in the next 4 years. And the question before the American people is, which one of these two candidates is best suited for the position? One, let me start with the vice president, is deeply immersed in what scholars of U.S. political science call identity politics, and obviously there are many articles on this and books on identity politics in America. She happens to be a woman of color. She is female, the first serious candidate to run in this position, and of course a minority at that, and represents identity politics. But here is the question. This is a candidate who is a Cold War liberal immersed in identity politics, and as a Cold War liberal who embraces diversity and multiculturalism, rejects doing something meaningful to end apartheid on the part of the Zionist state in Israel, ethnic cleansing, and of course the ongoing genocide. Just last night, unfortunately, there was another very serious bombing. Today is October 30th. On the 29th, there was bombing in both Lebanon and in Gaza. Hundreds of people were killed. The United States, by the way, did come out and again said it was against it. This is right 1 week before the election, right? Just as the United States was arguing that it was urging restraint on the part of Israel in hitting any target other than military target a few days ago, because it did not want the expansion of this war, considering that Iran, by the way, that Israel hit, has very powerful ballistic missiles that if it unleashes the bulk of them, there would not be an Israel. It would be the end of it. Israel, on the other hand, has 30 nuclear warheads, so it could wipe out Iran as well, which would trigger, more than likely, either a very bad regional war that would impact three continents: Europe, Africa, and that is Southeastern Europe, Western Asia, and Africa, Northern Africa, or perhaps a world war, a World War III, as many people have been fearing. Now, the United States election has a candidate, Kamala Harris, who rightly argues that she's multicultural, she's all for diversity and represents diverse interests, except when it comes to the Palestinians. So, on the one hand, here's a candidate, please think about this, who is in favor of women's rights to determine their own body. And to her credit, by the way, that is, she's in favor of women's right to choose. However, she has no problem with genocide. So the in terms of policy support, not that she would come out and say I have no problem with genocide, but the policy which as vice president she has gone along with, and the fact that she has repeatedly on the campaign trail argued that she is in favor of Israel's right to self defense, as though Israel is under attack by the civilians in Gaza. Yes, there is Hamas, which is Iran linked. Yes, there is Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is Iran linked. And they are not to be compared with the IDF. It would be the epitome of absurdity to compare those two ragtag organizations' resistance to apartheid Israel with a conventional conventional and nuclear power that Israel really is, by the way, a very powerful country behind which is the United States, as well as many Western countries, as well as India, a non-Western country. So we have to put this into perspective. So Kamala Harris has a problem with abortion, but she has no problem with genocide. When it comes to policy, again, I don't want to misrepresent the vice president. She has argued that she wants a ceasefire. She has argued that she wants to bring a negotiated settlement. This is her position, and it should be for a politician running for high office. However, the records of the Biden administration speaks for itself. The bombs just last night that killed all those people, October 29th, were US bombs. So the rhetoric is vacuous. In other words, it's hollow. It's meaningless because the reality is what it is. And this is a point that has been brought up before the Security Council. However, reporters, both in the State Department and the White House, have confronted spokespeople from the US government, obviously, when they come out and make these hypocritical claims. Oh, yes, we're against that. We're against that. However, we're giving them the means to carry out what we condemn now. So the hypocrisy of all this is rather astonishing. I want to move on to another issue about this election taking place against the background of the erosion of democracy in America and its move. And this is a very important theme for me because I am a structuralist. I have a structuralist approach to politics and political economy, as well as foreign affairs. I do not have an approach of cult of personality, although presidential politics is about cult of personality. You have a candidate like Kamala Harris, a minority, a female identity politics candidate, versus Trump, a right wing aggressive male with a very bad record as both personal and as a politician in terms of his abrupt, undiplomatic manner of dealing with people, as well as the reality that he is a neo isolationist, but that doesn't mean that he has not supported the military industrial complex by pouring massive amounts of money to it to placate them with while having serious reservations about becoming militarily involved because he's at least pragmatic enough to know the limits of American power, as the late Henry Kissinger used to argue. uh, one of the one of the traits of a good politician is to at least recognize the limitations of your own strength, of your power, how far you can go, and what consequence, what price you're going to pay down the road if you do cross the line. So the Trump candidacy is one that lends itself to cult of personality politics, as is the Harris candidacy, by the way. I don't have that kind of approach. I look beyond the politics of the cult of personality to structural issues, because when I see that the US has a strategic alliance that is unyielding from Truman to Biden, from 1948, 47, 48 to the present, from the Truman Doctrine to the present, I look at the record, it speaks for itself. And when I look at the fact that Trump is actually more, although Biden was the one who came out, I'm a Zionist, I'm a Zionist. And he is. Why deny him the privilege of being a Zionist? But Trump actually had his chance as president, and he proved to be just as big of an enthusiastic supporter for Zionism as Biden. Now, the American voters uh, do, on the margins, vote on foreign affairs, um, but it's only if they're intertwined with domestic issues. I started to say just before I veered off to the politics of cult of personality that we're living at a time, ladies and gentlemen, of very curious times here. There is a decline. There has been a steady decline, and international organizations that track the so-called democracy index of each country, and the United States is included, they downgrade the United States every year for obvious reasons. They ban books. They do redistricting so that blacks don't and minorities don't have, and working class people don't have as big a voice. There is massive concentration of wealth among the primarily white elites. So you have a trend toward authoritarianism under the neoliberal political economy since the Reagan era, and this is the background against which foreign policy operates, because foreign policy is a reflection of domestic politics, domestic policy. So the US, in part, has no problem with allowing with genocide in Israel. In fact, it supplies the means to carry out the genocide. Um, and doesn't see the elites. When I say the US, I mean the elites. I don't mean the American people, by the way, because they have no, let's face it, they have zero. A steel worker in Gary, Indiana has no influence. A farmer up in Wyoming has no influence in foreign policy. But Large corporations, from the military industrial complex, from defense contractors, in other words, to banks and so forth, do have influence. They do have the ear of politicians, partly because they supply the money. And we have had a convergence of the decline of democracy in America and the rise of authoritarianism, reflected in US foreign policy supporting an otherwise questionable regime in Ukraine with many pro Nazi elements in it. Not that Russia, this is not to justify Russia. I have been just as critical of Russia, by the way. Russia is run by all Putin and oligarchs. It's a quasi authoritarian system, not even quasi. It's an authoritarian system with the facade of elections and so forth. That there's no doubt about that. It's oligarchs linked to the Kremlin, to the state. In Israel, we have a Zionist apartheid state determined to carry out ethnic cleansing so they can realize the goal of a greater Israel, and in the process committing genocide according to the International Court of Justice and the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and UN, by the way, various spokespeople, rapporteurs in the UN, and many governments around the world. And the US and the West are allowing this. And this is reminiscent of the United States as well as much of the rest of the world allowing the Third Reich to carry out the crimes against humanity, namely the final solution, as the Germans called it, the Holocaust, in the 1940s during the era of Adolf Hitler. This is a very curious position to see this sort of thing allowed by civilized democracies. They claim to be civilized, they claim to be democracies, and yet they go along with this sort of regime. And the question, of course, for um, scholars as well as journalists who look at this on a daily basis is, why has the West slipped down this road of authoritarian politics reflected in a foreign policy, placating the regimes like the one in Israel, and have not done anything to guide Israel toward a different course, toward an open democracy, an open society, if you will. Now, I want to point out that um, in according to public opinion polls, besides the economy, of course, which is at the top of the voters' minds, there are issues related to foreign affairs that voters, American voters, right now in 2024 are concerned about. However, Israel and the Middle East are not at the top of the in the foreign affairs section when you look at public opinion polls. Uh, the At the very top is actually the issue of migrants coming up from the Rio Grande River, up from Mexico and Central America. That is actually an issue with underlying ethnocentric and racist overtones there. Long-standing, going back to the 19th century, right? Those of you who have studied American history, you know that. And much to the complaint of the Latin Americans, especially Mexicans and Central Americans. That's at the top of the list, by the way. The other issue is climate change. China is also a big issue for they're concerned about China. China is the big dog in the world economy based on GDP measured in purchasing power parity. 7 trillion above the United States and rising. The other issue, of course, is Ukraine, and of course Israel as well. It's not that they're not concerned about Israel, but they take it for granted that as the hegemonic culture reflected through the mass media, which molds the American public the voters' mind, the American public opinion, the molding of American public opinion through the mass media is that we just take it for granted. Of course, we're going to support Israel. Okay, so it's billions of dollars, taxpayer money that could have been used to lessen the 12% poverty rate in America, but it's not. To provide school lunches for children of working families on the edge of poverty, but it's not going there. It's going for bombs in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Yemen, and Iran, as well as bombs in for Ukraine to carry out its war, which could have been solved um, through diplomatic channels, as the government of Xi Jinping in China has suggested many times, by the way, in the last couple of years. Anyway, there have been. I don't want to mislead you. There have been times in the 20th century when elections were influenced by foreign affairs, but they were invariably intertwined with domestic affairs and with the perception of voters and their fate looking down the road. Let me start with the 1916 presidential election. The Democratic president Woodrow Wilson, who in 1916, by the way, was a presidential year, and he was running. He wanted to run for re-election. Um, he had serious reservations about the war. 1916 war had started in August 1914 in Europe, and Wilson figured, well, that's their business. We're staying out of it. We're a Western Hemisphere country. William Jennings Bryan, the Secretary of State, who was a creationist against Charles Darwin's evolutionary biology theory, by the way. William Jennings Bryan went to him and said, well, the fact is that Wall Street wants the U.S. involved in the war. And Wall Street has the means because it determines to an enormous degree, public opinion through the press back then, magazines and newspapers, and they could derail your bid for election. Wilson did argue that he couldn't possibly run on the platform of getting the U.S. involved because he knew the American people did not want, in 1916, didn't want involvement in the war. However, he agreed that secretly he would become involved, and he did. Right after the election, the U.S. became involved in World War I. The U.S. was preparing. In fact, Wilson is the one who set up the foundation for what we call today, for what the President Dwight Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. So he ran on a campaign. I kept you out of the war. I'll keep you out of the war. In fact, he was lying. He was going to get the U.S., and he did get the U.S. into the war. His opponent was a businessman. Wendell Willkie was his name. And he argued that Wilson was, in fact, a multilateralist. He was an internationalist. Willkie was right, by the way. Wilson was, those of you who studied American foreign policy, you know that Wilson was an advocate of internationalism. He believed in multilateral engagement. That's why he was the creator of the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations. So that election was determined by foreign affairs, by the way. Voters did go, they voted for Wilson, they kept him in, but he lied, he got the US involved. Then in 1920, the voters punished the Democrats for getting the US involved. and voted Republican. In fact, three successive administrations in the 1920s, one after the other, three presidents, all Republican, until the Great Depression in 1929 turned the fate of the Republican Party and made the Democrats, for a long time after that, the majority party in America, with Franklin Roosevelt coming to office in 1933. The election was in 1932. So the Wilson administration, 1916, 1920, that was decided. Those elections were decided by foreign affairs because of the influence of foreign affairs and the impact they had. That people have figured, well, what is the impact? What does that have to do with me? However, it had to do with war profiteers and banks, which made a lot of loans to France and Britain, by the way, and they wanted to make sure that France and Britain win. Excuse me. The next time there was influence in the election, it was 1940. FDR, an unprecedented third term. 1940, the war had started in Europe. Japan had invaded Manchuria, renamed it Manchukuo, the northeast, where Beijing is up there in the northeast of China. So in Asia and in the Asian theater, in the European theater, war had started. The question was, what would the U.S. do? The U.S. stayed out until after Pearl Harbor, but the U.S. had been preparing as early as 1938, when Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard, two European physicists, informed FDR that the the German scientists had, in fact, been working on developing the atomic bomb. So he started preparing the road for the atomic bomb. He started building a huge navy and so forth. So that election also was determined 1940. And then we come to the election of 1968. That too was determined by foreign affairs, the Vietnam War. Lyndon Johnson knew he was finished. He knew he was finished in 65. He knew in 65 that this war cannot be won. Bob McNamara, running the Defense Department, had more or less explained to him that this is going to be a tough one. And the Ho Chi Minh communist rebels from North Vietnam were not going to be defeated that easily. So he decided not to run. However, the Democratic Party split between the anti-Vietnam and the pro-Vietnam, the pro-war and the anti-war elements, giving, so that election was determined by the Vietnam War in 1968. That gave the opening, the splitting of the Democrats, and the fact that they carried the Vietnam baggage and all that came, the baggage that came with it, by the way. So Nixon comes to office. Then the next election after that was decided by Foreign Affairs was 1980, when Jimmy Carter, who in my view, by the way, was one of the best presidents of the post-war period, although he's not ranked very highly by professional historians. I disagree. I think he was a great president. Jimmy Carter was unfortunately came to office, and he had two revolutions. First in Iran with the pro-US, utterly corrupt, decadent, pro-Zionist Shah of Iran, toppled by a popular revolution that brought to power the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was in exile in Paris. So Iran becomes the enemy of the West, because Iran, although not pro-Soviet or pro-Chinese, was not pro-West either. Anti-Zionist to this day and anti-Western. Okay? Very clearly. Down the line. A theocratic regime, a throwback to the past. However, anti-Western, not, like I said, not pro-communist. Obviously, this is communists or atheists. This is an Islamic regime. The other revolution that happened in 1979 was, of course, Nicaragua. The Sandinista rebels take over in Managua. And so he's faced with these two revolutions during the worst time when there was an energy crisis because of the Yom Kippur War in Israel. And the OPEC and the Arabs uh, decided to punish the West for supporting Israel in its expansionist schemes, because the 67 and 73 war resulted in more land grabbing as part of the Lebensraum mindset. The Lebensraum is a German term, is a German word which means living space, and the Zionists were profoundly influenced by that. So the Carter comes in, and he's overwhelmed by all of this, and he was pulled by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was to the right of Jimmy Carter and some of the more progressive elements in the administration. And at the same time, Edward Kennedy did not help at all splitting the Democratic Party, and there was an independent candidate. I believe his name was Anderson. He ran as an independent. He took votes away because he was sort of more or less a Democrat. Anyway, so Reagan comes in. And then after that, the next election that may be determined to some degree, but in my view, very small degree, is this one in 2024. Kamala Harris against Donald Trump. This one, of course, is one that doesn't require really a lot of thought, because if we look at statistics, um, the Jewish vote combined with the Arab vote in America, although there are all kinds of press reports, hyperbole right and left, it's amazing how the media, from print to online stuff, it's sad how hyperbole, intended, by the way, to capture audience, um, is runs wild. This is a population. This is not Hispanics, 18% of the vote. This is a tiny percent, 4%, both Arab Americans and um, Jewish American Jews. They're a small percentage of the population. Now they do, with as far as American Jews, they do have deep pockets. But the fact is, there are a lot of American Jews. American Jews are just as heterogeneous. There are many of them against the Zionist regime, by the way. I want to stress that. And there are many of them who support openly, from small-time donors to billionaires, support Kamala Harris, and others who support Donald Trump. And there also the media is, although some of the liberal media has really thrown off a lot of people, with the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post, supposedly liberal, both of them, refusing to endorse Kamala Harris, the Democrat, um, using all kinds of inane excuses. The fact is that the media is also, leaning on one side or the other. Uh, the question is, does it really make any difference? And the answer is no, because it doesn't matter who wins. Strategic alliance of the United States with Israel will remain intact as it has since 1948, since Truman. It's not going to make any difference whether Kamala Harris or Donald Trump are in office. Donald Trump may actually cause more trouble because he tends to rally support among Arab countries. And I'm going to come to the structural theme of my thesis here, because he does try to get Arabs behind him to support Israel. Not that Biden hasn't tried, but he doesn't go. Just has not convinced. He has not been nearly as convincing. Let me put it that way. when you compare the 4 years Trump was in office versus the 4 years Biden, and I'm thinking especially of Saudi Arabia, by the way, um, where the Biden administration, the Democrats have tried to have their cake and eat it too from behind the scenes. Yes, yes, we're with you. Support the Zionist state, and I'll talk about the Arabs, by the way, and their support of Zionism, um, and from and publicly because the Biden and the Democrats cater to a identity politics back home, liberal identity politics. Oh yeah, we're against the human rights violations of the Saudis. So and the Saudis resent that. The Arab countries resent that. Period. Now the thesis that I pursue in analyzing, of course, the degree to which this election is determined by the role of Israel, especially what Israel did with Iran. And since Iran has been presented as the evil ultimate target that must be eliminated somehow, because it's behind every evil. Now, Iran did not force Israel, let's be honest, uh, to embrace a policy of Lebensraum as it has, and greater Israel, as many Arabs now fear, is the goal. Since 1955, the reason is because the Shah of Iran was in power in 1955. There was no theocratic regime. That's after 1979. There was no Hamas. That's after the revolution of 1979. There was no Hezbollah, no Houthi rebels down in Yemen, and no Hezbollah in Lebanon. They didn't exist. Yet, what did exist is the greater Israel goal and the Lebensraum ideology. That existed. And the US, by the way, went along with it based on the evidence, based on the historical record. We have to go beyond the rhetoric, which is inane and hollow, and look at the results. We have to look at the results. The results are, when you look at the Palestinians, what they remind me of are Indian reservations in America in the late 19th century, when the government in the US began to put them in reservations. Gaza is like an Indian reservation. Many people have called it the largest prison, open prison in the world. So the fact is, the US has um, gone along with this historically, because the US has been a major military and economic donor to Israel. Western companies, not just the US, but Western Europe as well, Western companies and Western governments have facilitated this. In order to do this, they had to convince their own people that their national security interests were intertwined with those of the state of Israel, although that state pursued apartheid and ethnic cleansing and now genocide. This is a very amazing and curious position to be in, considering these Western so called democracies are pursuing identity politics. Like I said at the beginning, you have the curious position of poor Kamala Harris. I'm in favor of women's right to choose. I'm in favor of gay men and gay women pursuing lifestyle choices. Okay. But I'm not in favor of Palestinian popular sovereignty. And by the way, I have no problem providing the bombs that realize the goal of Lebensraum for Israel. So this is really some kind of a new level of hypocrisy here because it's cherry picking identity politics. This identity politics I'm in favor of when it comes to Palestinians. Now, some have suggested, and I've mentioned in many of, because I like his work so much, of course, in many of my talks, I've mentioned the Columbia University professor, Palestinian American Edward Said, and his theory of Orientalism, who argued that, let's face it, there's underlying racism here on the part of the American elites and the media that pushes this stuff through to the voters, and they just don't question it. It becomes the norm. So it becomes the norm to, you know, let's concern ourselves about the Mexicans coming through the Rio Grande River over the river down in Texas. That's okay. We have to support. Israelis are civilized, although they're obviously on a daily basis. In the last year, over a year now, they have been killing civilians, including children and women, which the international courts have determined is genocide. They have also targeted United Nations personnel, doctors, medical staff, journalists, teachers, refugee camps, right? All war crimes, by the way. And yet, a blind eye to that. Blind eye to that. Okay. Kamala Harris, in fact, during the convention in August, National Democratic National Convention, did not permit a Palestinian American to speak at the convention. Gave no voice to them. There had been repeated requests on the part of the um, Arab American organization to meet with her, to put some things on the table, see where she stands. She shied them away. She shunned them, I should say, not shied them. She shunned them. She turned them away. So this is not to argue, by the way, that her opponent, Donald Trump, is not even more pro-Zionist. He is. Both candidates, by the way, have, I don't want to get into personal lives because I don't believe in cult of politics, in the cult of personality, rather, have connections personally to Jewish families. This is a structuralist issue. I believe that the issue is not necessarily AIPAC and the Israeli lobby and the billionaires who are pro-Zionists, both Jews and non-Jews, giving money to candidates to promote, both to Kamala Harris, by the way, and Donald Trump and the Democrats and the Republicans. That's not the issue. That's not all. That's just a manifestation of something else. It's a manifestation of the convergence ideologically, economically, politically, of US interests with Israeli interests. That's at the heart of what's going on here. And this election, the American voters, at some instinctive level, they may not be able to articulate this, but at some instinctive level, they know that there is a convergence of these interests. And both Israelis as well as Americans in the media and the political and military elites and the pundits use the word, we're part of the same Western civilization. What Western civilization? Genocide, by the way, is not civilization. I have news for both of those sides that argue that this is in the name of civilization. I don't know when genocide suddenly became part of civilization. It's just absurd to argue that this represents any sort of civilization. It is a violation of the Geneva Convention of 1949. It's not civilization. Now, it is difficult to know who will win the race based on public opinion polls, but it doesn't matter. By the way, based on betting, because you can trust that more because people put money on this, by the way. Based on betting, that is, people putting money on who will win, It's the edges to Trump based on the swing state voting. It's beginning to look like Trump, but it's still too close to call. It doesn't matter. The day after, not much will change. It's about management style. And again, I give credit to the American people for knowing that and at least and voting, at least knowing that and voting for individuals that they believe have credibility. And what the American people punish right now is the individuals that have been hypocritical. And the Democrats have been hypocritical, by the way. Not that the Republicans are free of hypocrisy, my God. No. But they have been hypocritical because they happen to be in office in the last 4 years, and the Ukraine and the Israeli wars have taken place under their watch because they give them the means to carry out these wars. So, and the voters now, this is the curious thing about Western, so-called Western civilization. American voters are in the curious position of voting for the lesser evil, the lesser evil, the lesser evil. This was also in the 1930s, voting for the lesser evil, the curious position of voting for the lesser evil. Let's not vote for the fascists or the Nazis. Let's vote for conservatives. They're the lesser evil. Now, the Democrats have accused Trump of being a fascist. And Trump, let's face it, he has often quoted Benito Mussolini. I have no idea why he would do that, but he has. And he doesn't shy away from extreme right wing groups, by the way, and individuals linked to the Ku Klux Klan and alt right and all kinds of fringe organizations, groups, extreme right wing, racist organizations, supremacist organizations he brought into the mainstream under the umbrella. The people who were responsible, some of those people were responsible for the January 6th riots up in Capitol Hill in 2021. So the fact is that we have here the American people looking at this election and thinking, okay, what do we do here? Now, again, one of the concerns is um, if the U.S. Should the U.S. be pulled by Israel, and there are a lot of analysts who believe that the U.S. is dragged in to this conflict by Israel. I'm not one of those, by the way. And that the U.S. is dragged into this, and it could drag Israel could drag the U.S. into a war with Iran, the way that it dragged it in under Bush, in a war against Iraq, because it wanted to eliminate another rival in the region, which is true, by the way. I believe in the convergence of interests thesis. The military industrial complex loves this. Wall Street, not all of them, but many of them love this because they make money. If you follow the money, if you follow the money, the investments, what you find is that there are companies that are making a lot of money in both Ukraine, and I'm not going to name the companies, both Ukraine and in Israel. And they are frightened of the fact that there have been calls for boycotting some of these companies. And some of these companies, and again, I'm not going to mention, there are a couple of them that have reported quarterly earnings and have reported some serious hits because people have been boycotting their products, by the way. So the fact is that we have two candidates, Harris and Trump, pro-Israel, right? Pro-Wall Street, pro-military industrial complex, representing the convergence of interests at the core of U.S. foreign policies since Truman, ideologically, in tune with the civilized campaign of Israel to defend itself against the evil Palestinians who are indistinguishable from Hamas. So all Palestinians are Hamas, right? It's demonizing the enemies is an ancient practice going way back to wars in classical Greece with the Persians and so forth. So you have a mindset here that the enemy is at fault, not the enemy on the defense, by the way, not the party attacking civilians. Okay, because among those civilians, I don't want to give the wrong impression, by the way, let me be very frank. Hamas is an organization. It's an unconventional paramilitary organization. Israel helps set it up, by the way, in order to divide the Palestinians from the Palestinian Authority to avoid the ultimate goal of a two-state solution, because the UN was going the route of legitimizing that process, as it still is trying to. Hezbollah has enormous support. This idea, this inane, absurd idea of trying to force the government in Lebanon to eliminate Hezbollah, as though it's not entrenched in all aspects of Lebanese society, is laughable for those people who actually know what the role of Hezbollah has been in the last 40 years in Lebanon, by the way, or the Houthis in Yemen. It's the same thing. Or the idea that Iran is somehow some kind of a paper tiger, some kind of a weak state, and no different than Iraq during the days of Saddam Hussein. It's not. Iran is much, much more powerful, with the considerable support of Vladimir Putin, who has openly warned Israel against doing anything outlandish, anything going all out against Iran. China is also behind Iran, by the way. So this idea of Greater Israel, Lebensraum, expanding, taking more territory recklessly, as though the others are sheep, or to hell with them, and they won't react, is the epitome of arrogance, by the way. But it's arrogance in the same manner that it's arrogant on the part of the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli equivalent of Israeli parliament, to vote against a United Nations relief agency, as it just has, and the United States perfunctorily coming out and say, "Well, we're against that. We're not supporting it. We don't support it." Although the U.S., especially the Republicans, are on record opposing that same agency. The hypocrisy, in other words, in all of this is the issue. And voters, by the way, voters may not know all the details, but they know hypocrisy. And this is why a lot of voters say, well, if the Democrats are accusing Trump of being a fascist, but their policy is pro-genocide, what are they talking about? Why should I vote for Trump? Who, by the way, is against the working class, against minorities, against women. He has a policy of, I don't want to say he's against women and minorities in that blanket statement, but he's against the fundamental interest of women's right to choose. Although he's waffled on the issue, he's against the interest of the working class when in labor management relations, trade unionization, for example, specifically, collective bargaining. He is against he's very much against migrants coming in, although they support the US economy. They enrich historically, by the way, those of you who have studied the history of migrants in the United States know that they have enriched the American economy. The election is on November 5th. We'll find out probably on the 6th. The winner, we may not, because it may be too close to call. But it really will not alter US policy, foreign policy, a great deal at all. Harris will be much more anti Russian, Trump, not so much. In fact, there may be a diplomatic settlement finally of that Ukrainian war, maybe, I don't know. The more than likely Harris will drag it out until the back of the Democrats is on the wall if she wins, and they do come to the table with China and Russia to end it. I think that the Ukraine war will probably end faster, and then I could be wrong, but I think that will end first, and then the one in Israel, and the one in Israel will probably reemerge later on because Israel has not given up the Lebensraum ideology, living space, space and race, to realize greater Israel since its existence. That's its goal. That's the reason for the Zionist state existing. I'm gonna thank you for watching. I'm gonna invite you to have comments and questions submitted, and I want to invite you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. It's an education channel. It analyzes various issues. It belongs to the channel is managed by my very good friend Asad Alim. It's an excellent source of education and information, by the way. Thank you very much.